Welcome to a presentation by Rebecca Lynch. Throughout the presentation, I will provide a summary of the theoretical positions of Albert Pope and look closely at the urban grid. I hope you enjoy my interpretations and examples. To introduce the urban grid, it is essentially a result of the need to divide, subdivide, and organize the urban environment. It has adapted to different uses and different contexts, and it's also had different meanings and implications throughout history. The grid can be described as having both complexity and simplicity all at once. Ancient Greek civilizations used patterns relating to their ideas of the cosmos to order many aspects of their lives, including the built environment. These orders were used to create weaving techniques for fabric and were eventually translated into the organization of their cities. With similarities to the weft and warp weaving methods, the ancient Greek grid was assembled with a series of evenly spaced and evenly aligned streets. No particular class of society was segregated or excluded, and people from all professions and walks of life were integrated into the community in an act of weaving the city together. This use of the grid is said to have created a harmonious and engaged community. Ancient Roman grids utilized two main streets and a series of smaller streets that all met the main streets on right angles. Public space was also integrated into the grid plan. Typically, a closed centripetal grid layout was used, with a walled exterior for protection of the town. The Roman grid represented order, and people from different classes were assigned to particular areas throughout the city. I would now like to take the opportunity to introduce Albert Pope, along with some of his theories and some of the driving ideas behind his research, work, and position within architecture and urban design. Albert Pope is an architect in Houston, Texas, and is currently a professor of architecture at Rice University. He is currently involved in an extensive planning project named Carbon 2065. I would say that Albert Pope is very well rounded in his research and perspectives within the profession, and he is driven by a passion for the growth of urban environments. He is also driven by the importance of the grid spatial typology in organizing the city, as well as a concern for the direction of urban development and a concern for the sustainable future of our planet. This includes factors relating to urban culture and well-being, especially regarding issues like walkability, as well as a vast range of environmental issues. To quote Alexander Povers, "The grid is distinctly experienced when the pattern is used for circulation, because the circulation grid is a weaving together of linear paths." He also describes the grid as being an essential part of our daily lives and states that the grid is easily understood and very clear. I believe that it is for these reasons of a clearly understood organization that the grid has been so successful in organizing a series of complex systems that form our urban context. Albert Pope states that during the urban reform in the 20th century, the grid was seen as a reductive and restrictive form of organization, stating that the grid was seen as a brutal form of making cities feel anonymous and a way of dehumanizing the urban existence. He states that the problem with this view of the grid is that it can actually be accurate to some extent, in that the grid can be reductive. However, the grid's ability to support complex systems and complex environments must not be ignored, and it has a profound effect on organizing this complexity of the city while allowing it to remain clear and functional. The 20th century negative views towards the urban grid began with the Garden City movement. Without getting too far off the topic of the grid, the Garden City movement was essentially a movement that focused on creating small pockets of communities with close connections to green space and less complex formations with limited access through the urban environment. With the onset of the Garden City movement and the direction that urban and suburban development has taken, Albert Pope explains that over the last 50 years, the grid has become a rare form of urban planning. The grid has made way for the spine spatial typology street and abundant cul-de-sac forms of urban planning. He suggests that we have created a non-walkable world by using these forms. Pope believes that by the grid spatial typology disappearing in our urban planning, that the city is also disappearing. And he explains that what's taking its place is undefined with an uncertain future, even though it already exists. Albert Pope defines the centripetal grid as being an isolating form that is separate from the surrounding context, while he also states that this condition does not exist in the centrifugal grid organization. To quote Albert Pope directly, in an open centrifugal organization, the grid is merely the coordinates of everywhere, and there is no such thing as an outside. An example of the benefits of a dense urban centrifugal grid is seen in this area of Barcelona in Spain. The centrifugal grid allows for an open system with unlimited expansion in all directions. The grid allows for an organized, rational layout that not only looks impressive from an aerial view, but also functions well from eye level. The grid enables wide roads and square blocks, with buildings that have the benefits of large courtyards, atriums, and areas of green space to benefit the comfort of the people who occupy the city. The grid allows for the benefits of additional natural light, improved ventilation, and connections with nature. Another important factor to mention is how the centrifugal grid enables connections to the surrounding community. Composition with red, yellow, and blue is a Mondrian painting that represents the centrifugal grid in the sense that the lines could be extended outwards, allowing for unlimited expansion in all directions. It is open and unbounded. It is as though we're viewing a small portion of what could be an infinite field. I also found an image of a geometric pattern that I think is an interesting representation of the centripetal grid. The grid seems to expand inwards, and it has a clear and defining edge with an element of seclusion forming around the surrounds. If this pattern was to be repeated, it would remain a series of separate elements. These two flowers are another way I thought of representing the two grids as described by Albert Pope. The rose for the centripetal grid and the daisy for the centrifugal grid. What I see is essentially the same series of elements in each flower. However, they are used in very different shapes and very different ways. This creates vastly different flowers with different qualities. They are both flowers. However, the rose has a central and inward focus, and the petals are closed. This creates a clear exterior and interior. Whereas the daisy expands outwards with the center exposed and the petals in an open formation. In summary of the examples I've provided for explaining the differences between the centrifugal and centripetal grids as per Albert Pope's descriptions, it is clear to see the advantages of the centrifugal grid and its ability to support the complex requirements of the city, while it also benefits communities, transport systems, growth and expansion, density, and it also enables connections to the surrounding context, all the while appearing simple and clear. At this point, I think it's really interesting to look at another perspective of why the clear and easily understood spatial arrangement of the grid is essential to the development of the city. So, I would like to briefly address the importance of cognitive function and how it relates to the built environment that we inhabit. Daniel Montello explores ideas relating to how human cognitive structures and processes are fundamentally related to how people perceive, experience, and behave in any given space. Clear and legible forms and spatial layouts influence wayfinding, visual access, and memory. To quote Montello directly, they influence the ease of learning the layout of a space, how accurately it is remembered, one's sense of privacy and territorial control in the space, and aesthetic and emotional responses to spaces, including feelings of beauty, fear, or boredom. In the introduction, I mentioned that Albert Pope is driven by a range of environmental issues. One example of this is that he expresses innovative ideas in relation to urban construction and architecture becoming a part of the carbon cycle. As we know, wood is carbon storage, and Albert Pope discusses the benefits of research initiatives in relation to timber in high-rise construction, as well as thinking of density as being related not only to buildings and population, but also to density of plantations for absorption of carbon from the atmosphere. And most importantly, he looks at how this can all be assembled into a functional and organised urban grid formation for the benefit of a sustainable future of our planet and a sustainable future for the culture of urban communities. Both Albert Pope and Rem Koolhaas discuss the Manhattan-New York grid extensively. Rem Koolhaas explains that the history of urban design and architecture in Manhattan has involved a series of immense successes and failures. He describes the 1811 Commissioner's Plan as creative, inventive, and highly ambitious. To quote him directly, he says that it is the most courageous act of prediction in Western civilization. Rem Koolhaas likens living in the urban design of Manhattan to a collective experiment, and he describes it as being related to a fantasy world that is totally fabricated by man. I personally have felt quite conflicted about the grid such as what we see in Manhattan being imposed so rigidly and creating this world that is completely fabricated by man. Leveling the topography of the land and not responding to natural forms, trees, or existing inhabitants. It removes the natural character of the landscape. However, when looking at its range of benefits to the community and the possibilities of new growth plantations for high levels of carbon absorption, the positives outweigh the negatives, especially when looking towards the possibilities of the future and the importance of creating unity. Rem Koolhaas sees a disjunction between the ingenious use of the urban grid in Manhattan and the last 30 years or so of architecture in Manhattan. He describes the architecture as generally of low quality, and he states that there's nothing striking or unique. This idea of disjunction provides a correlation with the writings of Albert Pope and Alexander Eisenschmidt, who discuss the conceptual divide between buildings and infrastructure, stating that the built environment is disjointed, describing the spheres of architecture and infrastructure as being mutually exclusive. Neither Koolhaas, Pope, or Eisenschmidt see the contemporary views of an ideal city being translated into the present built environment. Instead of the open, unbounded, centrifugal city that people imagine a free society inhabiting, the contemporary world is imploded. In the words of Albert Pope, it is clear that the city of our imagination is absurdly out of sync with the city of contemporary construction. Perhaps cities of the future can bridge the divide between buildings and infrastructure. Elements such as public space, density, transport, buildings, communities, and environment could all be working towards achieving the same goals for the future of urban spaces, and all while utilising the organising capacities of the grid. Thank you very much for taking the time to view my presentation.